Good morning. Thanks for coming, everyone, to this morning lecture. I'm David Abbott, partner at Clyde Co. I'm just going to tell you a little bit as part of our co-hosting with Menas. I get to give you a very short run-through on Clyde's and what it does before I hand over for the stuff you're turning up for. And just to say, we're hugely pleased to do these co-hosting with Menas, who we've worked with for a number of years. And Clyde's itself has a very big interest in the Middle East, interest in trade and finance and the things that are very active there, and also with Iraq. So we're very, very interested to hear about this 10 years on. In some ways, Iraq has sort of taken a bit of a back seat, certainly in some of the work that I do, as the financial crisis and the Arab Spring and other such has taken our attention. But it's obviously a vital country strategically, and it's going to be very interesting to hear what sort of state it's in. So I'm just going to take you very quickly through what we do. As you can see, we now have a very wide range of services through aviation, commercial, corporate, particularly energy is something we do all aspects of the energy world throughout the firm, finance, infrastructure, and all of the insurance and reinsurance aspects that go with the world of finance and trade, particularly trade finance. One of those, myself and the team that are co-hosting with Menas Other Political Risks and Trade Credit team, and we obviously support the world of trade finance through the world of insurance. Goodness, we also do projects, construction, shipping. It's never ending, and trade and commodities is a very important part, as I said, of what we do, and the insurance side of that as well. We're now a very global firm, and if you can see on the map, there's a concentration around the Middle East. We have the largest firm, I think that's right to say, in Dubai, the largest office in Dubai, and we have for a long time worked in that region, and we have affiliates with firms in Iraq, for example, and just to back that up, we've also opened in Libya to underline our connection with the area, and we thought we'd throw in Tanzania as well. I haven't been shipped off to any of these places yet myself, but you never know. If you need to contact us or want to talk to us about any of the things that come up today, or indeed anything in this type of world, then please give myself or Andrew a call. So that's my little bit. I'll now hand over to Charles and Menas, who will do the introductions and take the seminar forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're delighted to be here, and also very grateful to Clyde Co for co-hosting it with us, to have such splendid offices. We're going to be talking more about Clyde. We're going to be talking about Iraq today, and also Kurdistan. In some ways, it's difficult to be optimistic, or difficult to be entirely optimistic. One thing I would say is that we try to be as honest as possible, and also perhaps as unvarnished as possible. I think one of the things we're able to do is to say things that perhaps others don't necessarily say. I always remember somebody from Shell saying to me, whenever they see the Shell on my business card, they know what I think they want me to say. They know what I want to hear, and I'd rather hear it from somebody else. So I think in some ways, the advantage of being independent are considerable, but it does come with occasional health warnings. So just very briefly about Menas Associates. Obviously, most of you will know us, but some of you, because of your Clyde's contacts, won't necessarily do so. Menas Associates has been working for the last 25 or 30 years, not only on the MENA region, but also on other areas as well. We work on above ground, non-technical, non-legal risk. I'd also say that we are not oil experts, and so therefore if you want the latest on what's happening in the oil industry in Iraq or Kurdistan, then we're not necessarily the right people to go to. what we try and do is look at the politics and the security issues and other above-ground issues that will affect how companies can operate in these regions. Do go to our website. The other thing I would say is that we also work on international border disputes. We've started working, first of all, on Libya's disputes many years ago, and we work on others as well. We also now have 17 or 18 different publications. Some of them are weekly, some are monthly. They include Iraq Focus, which covers Kurdistan also in detail, and Alison is our author of Iraq Focus. At one time we considered closing it because Iraq seemed to be going nowhere. However, we did persevere, and I'm very glad that we did, and we've continued it, and there's growing interest, particularly in Kurdistan, but also in Iraq. And if you would like to see copies of it, then we'll send them to you. If you don't want to see copies of it, we'll still send them to you. And we can also send you a copy of the presentation. So I'm delighted to introduce Alison Pargeter, who is a very well-known expert, not only on the Middle East generally, but also on North Africa and on Iraq. And she'll be talking for about 40 minutes. One thing I would say is that, as a housekeeping note, first of all, please turn off your mobile. Secondly, another meeting is going to take place here at 10 o'clock. So once we've wrapped up, there will be an opportunity to talk later on. So, without further ado, Alison, thank you. Okay, I'll keep this for you.
Yeah, thanks, Charles.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. First thing to say is I actually lost my voice a couple of days ago. It seems to be coming back, but apologies if I get rather hoarse through this. Well, Iraq, 10 years on from the invasion and the toppling of the former regime, I think we can say Iraq is not the flourishing democracy or the beacon of hope in the region that some had hoped it would become. Despite the fact that there has been an improvement since the dark days of 2006, 2007, when sectarian violence was at its peak, things seem to be going from bad to worse again, and the country seems to be mired in a crisis that it's unable to extricate itself from. That's not to say that there haven't been positive steps over the last 10 years, especially given that the country has only just emerged from sort of years of brutal authoritarianism. We mustn't forget Iraq has had 2 national elections, it has a constitution. Despite the ongoing security problems, violence is not at the levels that it was in 2006, 2007, and Iraqis are generally much freer than they were before 2007. There's a relatively free and vibrant press, people can express themselves, and they have access to the outside world in a way that they couldn't have before. And also, for all the problems within the energy sector, oil production levels are up, they're beyond pre-war levels and are now at around 3.25 million barrels per day, bringing much needed revenue. So while there is good news, unfortunately, the country is still struggling, and there are sort of various key factors for this. Firstly, we've seen large political impasse since the elections of March 2012, and we're seeing none of the political blocs being strong enough to dominate and none of them willing to compromise. We're also seeing sectarianism taking hold in a new and I think more entrenched fashion, and none of the groups seems really able to overcome this. Now, despite the fact that all the parties declared in the run-up to the March 2010 elections that they were going to be the ones to go beyond sectarianism, so far none seem to be able to have moved beyond it, and this is crippling the political environment. I think we're also seeing a rise in the politics of localism, whether that be in the Kurdish region or in certain governorates and areas, and we're seeing local interest increasingly coming to dominate over national interest, as each region seems primarily concerned with what benefits it can accrue for itself. And so defending communal or sectarian interests seems to be paramount. And the situation has become so bad of late that Iraqis are beginning to ask again, is the country headed for another bout of serious sectarian strife? And the other big question on people's minds at the moment is, will Iraq be able to actually hold together as a country, or is it actually proving to be ungovernable? And this begs the question, will we see Iraq in the future splitting to form 3 separate entities under some sort of federal system? I think prior to the end of the last year, this would have been absolutely unthinkable. But there has been a gradual shift in perception over recent months, and people are talking about it not necessarily as a reality, but at least as a possibility. And I think some are concluding that this might be the only way to get Iraq out of its seemingly incurable state. So what I'd like to do today, really, is to firstly give an overview of the main forces that are shaping the Iraqi political arena, then to look at the key issues and challenges facing the country. And as Charles mentioned, I'm also going to take some time to look at the situation in the Kurdish region, given there seems to be a lot more interest in that region as a place to do business, and to look in particular at the thorny issue between Baghdad and Erbil, and then really to finish with an overview of where I think the country might be headed. So before I start that, I just want to give a very quick overview of a few key facts. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with these already. The Iraqi population is around 31 million, and I think we should remember that about 40% of those are under the age of 15. The Arabs make up 75 to 80% of the population, the Kurds about 15 to 20%, with others around 5%. And within that, the Shia make up 60 to 65%, the Sunnis 32 to 37%, and Christians and others about 3%. I'm aware that these figures are contested by some in Iraq, but that's a general approximation. And as I'm sure you're aware, the country is broadly divided into a Kurdish north comprising 3 governorates of Erbil, Dahok and Suleymaniye, which of course is governed by the KRG, a Shiite south where some 70% of the oil reserves are located. The centre has certain governorates that are dominated by the Sunnis, comprising Al-Anbar, Salahuddin, Diyala. And then there are the contested areas of Kirkuk and Nineveh, where Kurds, Sunnis and Turkmen are all vying for control. And lastly, of course, we have Baghdad, which again is now, particularly since 2006, 2007, divided into a Sunni West Bank, Al-Khurk, and the Shiite East Bank, Al-Rasafa. So moving on to the main political forces that are shaping the country at the moment. Most importantly, we have the main Shiite bloc, the National Alliance, that has 159 seats in the 325-seat parliament. This bloc came back together again after the March 2010 elections to ensure that the Shiites could form the largest bloc in the parliament and form the government. However, it's not an easy alliance. In fact, it's actually eating itself up from the inside at the moment. The alliance is headed by Ibrahim al-Jafari, but it's dominated by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and his State of the Law Alliance. Now, al-Maliki was always the strongest player in this alliance and has had the greatest public backing. But in the past few years, he's been able to really concentrate more and more power in his own hands. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on. And of course, he's also the leader of the Al-Dawa party. Then, the main rivals to al-Maliki within this bloc are the Sadrists, who have 39 seats and 8 ministries. They're led by the cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, and this current really represents the voice of the urban Shiite poor. They're strong in the poor Shiite neighbourhoods of Baghdad, like Sadr city, and in large areas of the south. They're known for their virulent anti-Americanism, but also for their charitable work and for defending the socio-economic interests of the poor. They're strongly supported by Iran, although al-Sadr seems to be moving away from Tehran somewhat these days. And as he's becoming more confident within the Iraqi political environment, he's developing slightly more of an independent path away from Tehran. Al-Sadr used to have his own militia, the Mehdi army, but this has been largely dormant since 2007. And since then, we've seen al-Sadr turn himself from firebrand preacher and militia leader into mainstream political actor. And at the last elections, he did surprisingly well. As I say, he won 39 seats. However, al-Sadr is still endlessly controversial. And in fact, he's become increasingly important on the political scene. Mainly because although he was never really keen on al-Maliki right from the beginning, he's increasingly taken on the role of acting as agitator and doing his utmost to undermine al-Maliki at every step. Al-Sadr has consistently voted against al-Maliki in the parliament, supporting key pieces of legislation intended to curb al-Maliki's power. And most recently, he supported the law that was passed in January 2010 to limit al-Maliki's term to 2 terms in office. I think this is a law that might well prove to be overturned later on, but al-Sadr supported it nonetheless. We also saw al-Sadr side with the Sunnis and the Kurds last year when they tried to bring a no-confidence vote against al-Maliki. And even more surprisingly, given his credentials, al-Sadr came out in support of the protests that are ongoing at the moment in the Sunni areas. Now, while this was partly a means of al-Sadr trying to prove that he was a man that can be truly Iraqi rather than partisan, and it also demonstrates a maturing on his part, it was also a serious attempt to further undermine his supposed political ally. However, despite all the noise, as of yet, al-Sadr hasn't quite taken the step of walking away actually bringing al-Maliki down, although some of his ministers notably did boycott a cabinet meeting this week. But rather, Sadr has acted mainly as an irritant, as a spoiler, trying to undermine al-Maliki but not actually finishing him off. Now, this is partly due to pressure from Iran, but it's also because al-Sadr doesn't want to do anything that might risk bringing down a Shiite government. He wants to see the end of al-Maliki, not Shiite control. So we can see that al-Sadr holds somewhat of a key. It was his support that enabled al-Maliki to have a second term in office, and he may be a key decider in whether or not he gets a third term, so he's certainly somebody to watch. The next bloc within the National Alliance is the ICSI, but actually the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. But the past couple of years has seen a major influence in the decline of this organisation. It's led by Amr al-Hakim, who used to be a powerful force, but his organisation's been watered down recently, largely because the Badr organisation moved away from him and teamed up with al-Maliki. So really he's become more of a mediating figure, but he's no real challenge to al-Maliki or power within his own right anymore. Moving on to the Sunnis, the main Sunni bloc that's headed by, although he's Shiite, Ayad Alawi, but the main Sunni bloc, Iraqiyya, has disintegrated massively over the past couple of years. Now, the reasons for this disintegration are mainly Alawi's failure to capitalise on his election victory of March 2010. Following that victory, the Sunnis were repeatedly outmanoeuvred by al-Maliki and failed to secure any real political power for themselves, and they found themselves systematically marginalised from the political arena, and this has created friction and accusations within the Sunni camp. And also, I think we should remember that Iraqiyya was never actually a cohesive bloc in itself. It was a collection of parties and groupings that only really came together before the March 2010 elections to try to prevent the Shiites from taking power. So now this alliance is fractured, although they're still nominally under the Iraqiyya bloc. We're seeing three main groups that have emerged. Firstly, the Accord group, which belongs to Ayad Alawi, but as I said, this is much weaker now, and it really seems that Alawi's time might have gone. Then we have the United Group, led by the Speaker of the Parliament, Osama Najafi, and former Finance Minister Rafa al-Isawi. And this is perhaps becoming the most powerful of the three main Sunni groups now. And it has a lot of local support in the areas where they're from. Najafi in Nineveh and Isawi from Al-Anbar. And it's proving a popular force at the moment. Then we have the Reform and Development Party, led by Salah al-Mutlaq, but he's a rather sort of controversial figure for various different reasons. I don't think he's going to get that much support. Lastly, we have the Kurds. You have 43 seats in the parliament, made up of the two ruling parties, the KDP and the PUK, plus opposition parties. Now, these groups may have a rather sort of troubled relationship in the realm of their own Kurdish politics, but they've tended to come together in the face of any national crisis or in national dealings to try and put on a united front in their dealings with Baghdad. And I think they learned a hard lesson from March 2010 elections when the opposition stood separately to the two ruling parties, and it cost them dear, and they're not going to make the same mistake again. However, that being said, it doesn't mean that they always agree on big national issues. We've seen major disagreements over key issues, such as over the no-confidence vote in al-Maliki last year, when the KDP strongly supported it and the PUK were more reticent. And at the moment, these two parties are currently disagreeing over whether Kurdish ministers should stay in al-Maliki's government or whether they should resign. However, I think we're going to see them working together in the next elections. So moving on to the key issues and challenges facing Iraq at the moment. As I said before, I think the main problem that's stalling the country is this political impasse. And it seems that Iraq's different political blocs have proved utterly incapable of working together. And this really has gone on since the March 2010 elections. There have been attempts to try and pull things together and work together, mainly the Erbil agreement that would see a genuine power sharing between the different blocs. But this has failed, primarily because, as I said at the beginning, neither side has been able to move beyond sectarianism or ethnic politics, and they're all defending their own communities, and they all fear ceding power to the other side. And this sectarianism has become so deeply rooted that neither side seems to be able to reach out to the other. I also think, in this respect, we're seeing the continuation of the personalisation of politics. Key issues seem increasingly to be reduced to bitter, acrimonious relationships between the main players. And I think we can probably say that Iraq has no truly national political leader, aside perhaps from Jalal Talabani, He was one of the few figures who seemed to be able to transcend this localism, but as we know, he's now very ill. So instead, we're really seeing personalities defending communal or sectarian interests. And this has meant that neither side has been willing to compromise. So whenever we have an attempt at dialogue, it's almost a foregone conclusion that this dialogue will fail. And we've got to the point where there really isn't any appetite for dialogue left, and all sides seem to know it's going to be a waste of time. And this has resulted in deadlock, and with no single bloc strong enough to dominate, the whole political scene has really been at impasse for the last 3 years. And this has meant that the whole of Iraq has been held hostage to this political crisis. Development isn't going ahead, money's not being spent, services are not being improved, security is deteriorating again, and corruption has been allowed to eat its way through the country to the most staggering proportions. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any clear way out of this situation. Next big issue facing the country is what I call a new authoritarianism. Al-Maliki may have alienated his political rivals and indeed some of his political allies, but he's actually worked steadily over the past few years to consolidate his own power base, and he's done so in the shrewdest of ways. And until recently, he's always seemed to work his way through every crisis and somehow, miraculously, to come out on top. And over the past 3 years, he's done this by taking control and extending his control over different institutions in the country, primarily the security sector, as well as retaining the post of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He's endlessly avoided actually appointing any of his rival blocs to head up the defence, interior or security portfolios in the government, something that had been agreed a few years ago. But actually he's kept all of those ministries in his own hands. And he also has developed his own forces over the years, like the Baghdad operations. And he's ultimately got almost complete control over the security sector. Likewise with national institutions, he's managed to wrestle control over institutions such as the Electoral Commission, the Justice and Accountability Commission, and most notably the Federal Court. And this is absolutely critical, as this court has overturned key laws in Parliament that have been passed as a bid to try and curb his power. And it also ruled that any decision made by the Parliament has to be approved by the government, and something that clearly gives al-Maliki huge power over the political arena. And al-Maliki has cleverly been able to put his men in all the right positions in these institutions to extend his power across the country. Al-Maliki has also more or less retained control of the energy portfolio. The main energy man in Iraq is the hawkish Hussein al-Shahrastani, who moved away from his post of Deputy Oil Minister a few years ago, but he's still the main man in control of the sector, and through his position as Deputy Prime Minister for Energy Affairs. Some might argue that he's not done a particularly good job with Iraq's energy sector, but still he and al-Maliki ultimately have control of the energy sector. Al-Maliki's also come to dominate the political arena, and he's done this through a very clever two-pronged approach. On the one hand, he's tried to dominate the political arena by just moving his rivals out of the way. He's used the courts and other institutions at his disposal to incriminate his rivals and move them out of the scene. We saw that most notably perhaps with Tariq al-Hashimi, the vice president, who was up on terrorism charges, and Maliki's also tried it with other figures, including most recently the finance minister. And actually an Iraqi source close to the Dawa party told me recently, Maliki's drawers are absolutely stuffed full of files on all of his political rivals that he can pull out at any time when he needs to. But at the same time, al-Maliki has also sought to divide his rivals, courting various elements and successfully bringing them over to his side. Now, although a lot of these alliances haven't been sustainable, he's managed to bring enough of them over to get through crises. And what we're seeing at the moment, for example, he's setting up a new group called the Sons of Iraq with some Sunni tribal sheikhs in the Sunni provinces who are now supporting him. And following in the footsteps of the former regime, actually, he's learned very well how to distribute benefits to tribal sheikhs and key personnel, including among the Sunnis, to bring them over to his side. And so his ruling style is proving increasingly unpopular with his political rivals, but I think it's important to mention that actually al-Maliki remains hugely popular with his own constituency. Many ordinary Shiites will tell you that he's good, and mainly that he's strong, something that counts for a lot in Iraq. However, for all the power that he might be able to consolidate, al-Maliki clearly cannot rule over Iraq alone. He's not strong enough to rule on his own, and he needs to keep others on his side, and he somehow has to maintain that balance in order to rule. As to how things are at the moment, it seems that he may just have pushed things too far this time. And for all his ambition to have a third term in office, it's still not clear whether he'll be allowed it. And this is partly because he's pushed things to such an extent that we're seeing an explosion of widespread Sunni discontent on the ground. Now, this is based on strong grievances among the Sunni community, and they have a strong feeling that despite their re-entry to the political arena after the March 2010 elections, after they boycotted the previous elections, they've been deliberately marginalised by al-Maliki and the Shiites. And they also feel they're being targeted in other ways. The anti-terrorism and de-Baathification laws, for example, that have resulted in thousands of arrests in the Sunni governorates, many people being detained without charge, has also created serious problems. And as we saw in December last year, the last straw was al-Maliki's attempt to try and move the Sunni finance minister Ali Sawi out of the way. And this has resulted in this outburst of protests that have taken grip of the Sunni regions and have been ongoing since December 2012. There have been demonstrations every Friday, specifically against al-Maliki and calling for his downfall. And these protests have gathered momentum and are a major issue now for the Prime Minister. It's interesting that so far no single political force has actually been able to dominate this new Sunni activism. And actually its strength is that it's a coming together of political, tribal, religious and local forces all united in their desire to see an end to al-Maliki's rule. Although some forces are emerging within this arena, Najafi and al-Isawi's united group, also the Iraqi Islamic Party, the Iraqi arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, is also sort of proving to be quite popular there. But mainly this is a widespread popular expression of anger and discontent against al-Maliki. And I think the main thing to note about these protests is that they look as though they're not going to go away anytime soon. Al-Maliki might have hoped in the beginning by ignoring them or dismissing them, I think he described them as a bubble when they first started, that they might fizzle out. But instead, I think we can see a real determination on the part of the Sunnis not to stop until their demands are met. And they're getting stronger, as the recent resignations of 2 Sunni ministers in the government shows. And the fear about these demonstrations is that if they're not handled properly, they might develop into something more serious, namely further sectarian strife. Now, although they started out as peaceful and there was a deliberate bid on the part of the protesters to avoid sectarian slogans, as al-Maliki's continued to dismiss them, and as he's employed a rather heavy-handed approach in dealing with them, the demonstrators have become more assertive and more aggressive. And so they're increasingly being interpreted by Shiites as a deliberate act of sectarian aggression, and they're polarising the country. And this is clearly a potentially dangerous situation that al-Maliki needs to get a grip on. Yet, as we've seen, compromise is not really a word that's in al-Maliki's dictionary, and quite how he's going to get himself out of this particular hole has yet to be seen. The other big issue, of course, is that of the Kurds, the Kurdish issue. We're also seeing the Kurds becoming increasingly disillusioned with the Iraqi political scene. After the toppling of the former regime, the Kurds had really hoped that they would be considered as true partners in the new Iraq. And for them, this is proving not to be the case. In fact, I think in many ways, the Kurds still feel as though they're outsiders. They're still eyed with suspicion by Arab Iraqis and by the Sunnis in particular, who fear that they're not truly committed to the country and that their real agenda is to create an independent Kurdish state and to break up Iraq. Meanwhile, the ongoing fear on the Kurdish side is that they will be sidelined and marginalised as they were in the past. And so while they might have government posts and be part of the parliament, etc., they feel they're not really being treated as equals. And they're also angry that their demands just are not being met. After the March 2010 elections, they gave their support to al-Maliki to become Prime Minister, and somehow they thought they were going to be the kingmakers. And they thought that the Erbil agreement that was proposed by Barzani would allow them to become equal ruling partners, and that bit by bit they would be able to get their main demands met. However, this hasn't been the case. We've seen absolutely no movement on the issue of the disputed areas, particularly Kirkuk, which they claim as their own. Article 140 in the Constitution, which would regulate the status of Kirkuk by holding a census and then a referendum on whether or not the region wants to be part of the Kurdish area, is no closer to being implemented. And al-Maliki has continued to sweep what he sees as the whole uncomfortable business under the carpet. And really the Kurds feel that they're no closer to getting what they want in what has become the cause célèbre of the Iraqi Kurdish nationalism, this issue of Kirkuk. The other issue, of course, where they feel they're not getting what they want is over oil, but I'm going to go into more detail about that later on. And this frustration is pushing the Kurds closer than ever to think about independence as a real possibility. I think before, the issue of independence for the Kurds was always used more as a bargaining chip. Threatening independence was a way of sort of getting some sort of leverage in its relations with Baghdad. But I think the situation has become so bad, and the Kurds, or at least the KDP and Barzani, seem to have come to the conclusion that they will not get their rights, and therefore independence has become a serious proposition on the horizon. And all of these issues are clearly serious challenges facing the country. But I'm just going to move on now to talk briefly about the situation within Kurdistan. Excuse me. Well, as we're all aware, the Kurdish region has made impressive strides since 2003. The Kurds have pulled together, they've created a functioning region that's clearly doing much better than the rest of Iraq, certainly from a security point of view, but also from an economic one. The main players are clearly the two main ruling parties, the KDP that has control over Erbil and Duhok, that's known for being more tribal and more traditional. The PUK has control over Suleymaniye, and it's generally considered to be more progressive, more urban and more liberal. The support and legitimacy for these two parties comes primarily through their role at the forefront of the liberation struggle for throughout the long years against the former regime. And they're still the dominating players in the political scene. However, over the past 2-3 years, we've seen the opposition really sort of gaining a surge of support and challenging the ruling parties in a serious way and really changing the fabric of the Kurdish political scene for the first time. The opposition comprises a range of parties, the main one being Goran, that's led by former PUK member Nushawan Mustafa. Goran made particular dents in the PUK-controlled areas, and in fact you can see from the 2009 election results how well they did. They managed to get 25 seats, in spite of the fact that when you talk to them, they say that people are still frightened to vote for them because doing so still brings risk of retribution. The Islamist parties in the region are also showing a new support. Support for these Islamist parties is growing particularly in poor areas like Halabja and Zakho that have not seen the growth and economic boom experienced in Erbil. And it's because of this growth in support and the fact that the opposition are becoming a serious pressure point that the Kurdish Prime Minister Necip Barzani tried to co-opt them and persuade them to join his government at the end of last year. However, the opposition have refused, and they are still proving a potent force in Kurdish politics. Now, while the KRG has a functioning democratic system of sorts and is making strides, the region itself is also clearly facing key challenges and problems. I think the main challenge is still the issue of two-party rule. Now, while the two ruling parties have tried to address this problem, actually the rule is still dominated by the two parties who essentially run two separate administrations, and everything is still divided up and agreed between them. Thus, while the region might have a government and a parliament, I think most of the main issues are still largely agreed between the two parties beforehand and then are brought to the parliament to be rubber-stamped. And this means that party interference in governance is still rife. And although, to be fair, they have tried to address this, it still remains a serious issue. And this is something that the opposition are trying very hard to combat. There have been repeated calls on the part of the opposition for the government to reform, for it to be more transparent, including in the energy sector. And there are all sorts of accusations about how Ashti Harami has the whole thing wrapped up personally and nobody else knows what's going on. The opposition is also calling for the constitution to be changed to shift to a parliamentary system that would weaken the control of the president. However, as yet, the main parties have shown an unwillingness to do anything other than really talk about reform. The other issue for the Kurds is Talabani's ill health. This is a serious issue actually for the whole of Iraq, because Talabani was seen as the one mediating figure who could actually bring all of the different sides together and bring them around the table. But his ill health and his removal from the political scene actually is a far bigger disaster for the PUK. And I think the main issue for the PUK is that there's no clear successor to Talabani, and the PUK is itself factionalised. One name that's doing the rounds is Barham Saleh, the former Prime Minister, and some Kurds have told me that he's not tribal enough. The other possibility is Hero Talabani, Jalal Talabani's wife, but there's resistance to her in other quarters. So as yet, there's no clear indication as who could replace a giant like Talabani. And I think a lot of the PUK are all sort of desperately hoping that Talabani will somehow return to the political scene, and they don't know how to get past it. The removal of Talabani clearly sees the weakening of the PUK, and that could play into the hands of the opposition, particularly Goran, that's strong in PUK territory. Although, of course, it won't help the KDP, as I think party lines are so entrenched that they'll never be able to make inroads into the PUK areas. The other big issue affecting the region is corruption. And of course, this is a challenge for all of Iraq. But I think it's sometimes forgotten about when we talk about the Kurdish region. It exists in the KRG most definitely as well. And the whole area really seems to be sewn up by the main players, the Barazanis in the KDP areas and the Talibanis in the PUK. Those connected to the Barazani tribes, for example, in Erbil, seem to have control over almost every business sector, and it's a common complaint among ordinary Kurds and taxi drivers and whoever you speak to. Nepotism is also rife. And it seems that in order to get anywhere in the region or achieve anything, you have to have the right connections and be part of the ruling parties. And even the PUK members complain that their members in Erbil can't get jobs because all the jobs in Erbil are taken by KDP members. So it's easy to see why the opposition increasingly appears to be voicing the demands of the street. And I think we have to realise that times have changed, and young Kurds are no longer willing to accept the struggles of the past and the liberation struggle or the current battle with Baghdad as a valid excuse for the lack of services, the lack of jobs and the socio-economic difficulties or the limits on freedom of expression. And we saw large-scale demonstrations in Sulaymaniyah at the time of the Arab Spring. Other demonstrations like that have flared up over recent years, for example in Duhok. While that situation was contained, I think this public outcry could easily flare up again. As while things are getting better in the region, there's still an enormous gap between the rich and the poor, and a growing sense that the ruling parties just aren't willing to open up, to reform, or to meet the demands of the population. I don't think the ruling parties are in any real danger yet, but I think the strains are likely to increase. The other main challenge, of course, for the Kurds is how to manage their relations with Baghdad. I think we can say relations have deteriorated to the point of almost no return between the two sides of late. But even this has become extremely personalised as well. And the main tensions seem to be between al-Maliki and Barazani. Talabani and the PUK have a somewhat less tense relationship with al-Maliki, but clearly there are still major problems. But I think we can say in general the relationship between the centre and Erbil is at its lowest ebb since the fall of the former regime, and especially following the recent ratification of the budget in Baghdad where the Kurds' demands were ignored. Now, one of the main issues of contention, of course, is over energy policy, over who has control of what resources. And this, of course, sits within the wider debate about control over territory and rights. But oil, who's controlling the oil and its revenues, is right at the centre of antagonism between the two. And increasingly, this seems to be a sort of impossible and intractable situation, and neither side looks willing to back down. One of the main issues, of course, is over contracts. Erbil signing contracts with IOCs that Baghdad insists are illegal and that the Kurds insist are fully within the constitution. Now, this situation has reached particular fever pitch of late because IOCs seem increasingly to be turning away from Baghdad in favour of Erbil, and this has prompted anger and fury within the federal government. Now, it's not difficult to fathom why these companies are doing so. Erbil's sort of played a much shrewder game where Baghdad has not. As I'm sure you're aware, Erbil has offered production sharing contracts and a more stable and secure operating environment. Baghdad, on the other hand, has so far stuck with its service contracts and not very appealing terms. Now, it's had to do this because of resource nationalism that's still strong, and I think there's a real populist fear of giving the country's wealth away to foreigners within Iraq. So Baghdad has found itself stuck with these not very good terms. So companies are increasingly choosing Erbil. Now, Baghdad's tried to get around the situation by insisting that any company that signed with Erbil couldn't invest in the rest of Iraq. However, Baghdad's bluff seems to have been called, and companies seem increasingly to be voting with their feet and choosing the KRG over the centre. However, at the moment, Baghdad has one bargaining chip with Erbil, and that, of course, is exports. And it's still insisting that all exports have to be done via SOMO, the state marketing company, and that all revenues go into the federal purse. Now, as we've seen recently, Iraq is refusing to pay the full sum owed to foreign companies that have been operating in the Kurdish region out of the federal budget. Now, this issue has been going on for a long time. They keep striking deals, and then Baghdad tends to back out. But most recently, al-Maliki went ahead and ratified the budget without Kurdish approval and without including the full sum they'd been asking for to pay the companies enshrined in the budget law. They agreed to a much lower sum than the Kurds had demanded. Now, this has left the Kurds in a major dilemma. It means they've either got to pay the foreign companies operating in the KRG their costs out of their 17% share of the national budget, something that would leave them with a serious shortfall, or they risk trying the patience of foreign companies even more. And I think this whole budget issue was a particular disappointment for the Kurds, because what they were really hoping for was to get this payment enshrined in the budget law so it could apply to future years. However, while Baghdad might be willing to release a bit of money here and there, it has absolutely no intention of tying itself into such an obligation. And this is hardly surprising, as it would remove some of its leverage over Erbil. So I think Baghdad is likely to continue to sort of play games, if you like, on this matter. And it's going to do everything in its power to prevent the Kurds from further developing their energy sector, something that Baghdad fears will take them closer to independence. Now, of course, the new spanner in the works recently has, and something that has also taken relations to real fever pitch, has been the issue of this possible pipeline deal with Turkey. Now, the Kurds are trying to defend such a deal by saying that it's constitutional because all the revenues would go into the federal budget. However, understandably, it's rather like a red rag to a bull for Baghdad. And while there are many indications suggesting that this deal is going to go ahead, of course, it's not a done deal yet, and there's also a lot going against it. Firstly, of course, Ankara would poison its relations with Baghdad, or at least with al-Maliki, beyond all repair. Baghdad's never going to countenance such a deal because it fears that it will give the Kurds the ammunition they need to really go it alone. Now, as we know, relations between Turkey and Baghdad were already tense, but whether Turkey will actually push things that far has yet to be seen, especially given that Turkey has huge economic interests in the rest of Iraq as well as in the Kurdish region. Turkey is also seems to be coming under a lot of pressure from the US at the moment not to go ahead with the deal without Baghdad's approval. And I think Turkey is still anxious about the prospect of an independent Kurdish entity on its doorstep, given its own Kurdish minority. Moreover, the Turks know that al-Maliki is not going to stay in power forever, even though it might seem like it sometimes. They may ultimately decide that they don't want to lose Baghdad for the sake of Erbil. Therefore, while on an energy and economic level the deal may make good sense, it's not necessarily the case on the political level. At the moment, the Turks are keeping their cards very close to their chests, although the Turkish energy minister seems particularly hawkish on the deal. And in Iraq, it seems that both sides are doing their utmost to force a reality on the ground. Oil Minister Louaybi's recent declaration that Turkey had given its assurances to Baghdad that it wasn't going to go ahead with the pipeline without Baghdad's consent seems somehow reminiscent of the endless statements issued by Baghdad about how ExxonMobil had given it guarantees that it wasn't going to sign a contract with the KRG. At the same time, the Kurds are insisting that the pipeline is a reality. Sort of senior Kurdish political advisors have told me that the pipes are already in the ground and it's all going ahead. So I think it's very difficult to predict how this is all going to pan out, but I think we can say either way it's going to be an explosive issue. And all of this means that the country is further away than ever from being able to pass the all-important national oil and gas law. With all sides at each other's throats in this way, it just seems like an impossibility. So we're no closer to that. If anything, we're further away. As to whether the situation between Erbil and Baghdad is likely to escalate to the point of full-scale military conflict, well, despite the fact that these sides have had their troops lined up against each other over the past few months, and despite the fact that there's a strong view in the Kurdish region that al-Maliki will stop at nothing, In fact, I think full-blown war still seems highly unlikely. I think both sides have too much to lose. And I think we should remember too that some of the posturing may be for domestic consumption on both sides. However, it is something that needs to be watched, and a wrong move on either side could result in an escalation of tensions at any time. Moving on briefly, just to look at the regional fault lines and regional issues facing Iraq. Clearly, neighbouring states of Turkey, Iran, the Sunni Arab Gulf, Sunni Arab states have a huge interest in Iraq, and we're seeing each side backing their players in the country in a bid to extend their influence. As a result, it seems that Iraq's becoming like a new fault line in the regional political scene. On the one side, we're seeing Iran, Syria, Iraqi government lining up on one axis, and on the other, we're seeing a Sunni axis that has Turkey at the fore and that's supporting the Iraqi Sunnis and the Kurds. And I think it's notable, actually, that in some of the Sunni protests that have been going on, some of the protesters have been holding up pictures of Erdogan. The other issue, of course, is the potential fallout from Syria. It could have serious repercussions for Iraq. I think we can say al-Maliki still views the conflict primarily as a sectarian one. And while he supported revolutions elsewhere during the Arab Spring, I think the al-Maliki government feels the need to stand by al-Assad because mainly it fears the consequences of a Sunni government in Damascus. This would clearly bolster the Sunni camp in Iraq and the Sunni axis. We also need to remember that al-Maliki doesn't have proper control over his borders, and there's fears that the conflict could spill over, well, it already is to a certain degree, and that al-Maliki could see himself challenged further by Sunni components. And there are also growing fears that Iraqi and Syrian militants are working more closely together. So moving on to the future outlook. Well, I think it's very, very difficult to predict what might happen next in Iraq. And it's really hard to see how the country can get beyond the crisis that it's in at the moment. While the various political players might not be very enamoured with al-Maliki, they just can't seem to bring their forces together enough to actually bring him down and finish it. This is partly because there's a lingering sense of distrust among the other players. The Sunnis and the Kurds are particularly suspicious of each other based on their past history, likewise for the Sadrists and the Sunnis. And this really seems to be preventing the various groups from coming together to actually do the dirty on al-Maliki. Even now they're threatening to pull out of the government, they're boycotting cabinet meetings, but they're not really prepared to go the whole way, and that's why we're stuck. Al-Maliki is trying to get beyond the impasse by doing everything he can to survive. He's currently pushing to form a majority government, and he's desperately trying to bring whoever he can on board. However, the likelihood of him being able to master that, I don't think, is very strong. He's alienated too many forces along the way over the years to get enough of them to stand by him. And such an outcome is also being resisted by members in his own national alliance, particularly the Sadrists. And also, I think al-Maliki knows that if he were to go ahead and form a majority government with some Sunni faction, he'd end up alienating most of the rest of the Sunnis, meaning that the security situation could deteriorate even further. If al-Maliki is unable to form a government and the government collapses, then we're likely to see early elections. But this isn't necessarily going to be a solution. I think we're likely to see similar voting patterns based on sectarian and ethnic divisions. Thus, this sort of impossible balance is likely to be brought back again. And I think that the most likely scenario will be that the impasse will continue and that al-Maliki will somehow worm his way through the crisis once again. As some Iraqis described him recently, he's like an ox. He can shoulder any burden that comes his way, and through sheer bloody-mindedness, he just keeps going. And it's this tenacity that so far enabled him to pull through against all the odds. And I think he may just do so again, and he may even manage to go on for a third term. However, if this happens, this is going to be clearly disastrous for Iraq. The country will continue to limp along politically. It means Iraqis will continue to become disillusioned with the political class and their experience with democracy, and it will also mean that proper development remains stalled. This stuck political situation will also mean that the security situation will remain poor for the foreseeable future. Which brings me to finish off with a few questions about the country's future. So, are we likely to see renewed sectarian strife? Well, I don't think we're going to see the levels of sectarian violence that we saw in 2006 and 2007. I think Iraqis are exhausted by it. However, the possibility of increased sectarian violence clearly hasn't gone away and is looming on the horizon again. And if the protests in the Sunni governance are not resolved, I think the situation could turn bloody and Iraq could find itself mired once again in serious sectarian attacks. Will Iraq break up? Well, I think we should remember there's still huge resistance to this possibility inside the country. Federalism is still seen somewhat of a dirty word. It equates to division and strife. In the minds of some, it's tied up with post-colonialist plots to divide and rule. And also, religious leaders are warning strongly against any breaking up of the country. However, you can't deny that as well as the Kurds, other communities are increasingly coming to talk about breaking up into 3 units as a possible solution. And for the first time, we're seeing serious talk in some quarters, including in Sunni quarters, that this is the only way these communities can secure their rights and protect themselves. Obviously, the practicalities of this are yet far from being fleshed out. How would Baghdad work? How would the other mixed governance work? It doesn't seem very practical. In fact, it's mainly a reaction against the status quo rather than a well-thought-out support for the dividing Iraq up into regions. So I don't think a divided Iraq is on the immediate horizon, but I think if things continue as they are, calls for such a solution are likely to grow, and one wonders where we might be another 10 years down the line. And lastly, this begs the question really as to whether Iraq's political blocs and leaders can find it in themselves to move on beyond the past. At the moment, somehow politics seems to be grounded in the past, and despite the new experience with democracy, the main blocs still seem entrenched in their own communities, and relations between them still somehow seem to be delineated upon the hangover of the days of the former regime and the grievances related to that time. And I think until this shifts, the country is unlikely to really be able to put the past behind it and move on and create the kind of prosperous and dynamic state that so many Iraqis crave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I told you we'd have the unvarnished truth, or at least our version of it. So we have perhaps 10 minutes for questions, and then if you'd like to remain behind and carry on the conversation, we'd be happy to do so. So if you're going to ask a question, can you just say your name and also where you're from? Yes.
My name is Shelley Dean. I'm from International Alert. Thank you for your very comprehensive assessment. I'd like you to elucidate a little bit on the commercial dynamics in the financial sector. You didn't allude to that terribly deeply. Can you talk a little bit about the CBI and the impact that the Shabibi scandal has had on Citibank deciding to delay its investment in Iraq?
I'm afraid the answer to that is probably no, because I am not an expert by any means on the financial sector. Really, it's not something that I'm capable to talk about. I'm sorry.
The second question then is a nicer one.
Okay.
April 20th, the regional elections. What's your prognosis?
The local elections. Well, at the moment, it looks like they're not going to be held. al-Maliki's called them off. The Sunnis are pushing hard for them to be held. Clearly, they want a change in dynamics, a change in the status quo. But I think really the country is in such a crisis and in such a terrible state that I can't see how they're going to go ahead. And particularly if al-Maliki is going to dig his heels in. He tends to get his way by manoeuvring his way around. And so as things currently stand, I can't see that they're going to go ahead, no.
Question back to
Alistair Morrison with Gold Keystone. Where do you see the situation in 12 months?
In 12 months?
For instance.
Okay,
I know
yeah.
there's a lot of this might happen, this might long term, but
Sure.
what's your opinion in 12 months' time?
Okay, I mean, it's very difficult to say. Everything is so fluid. My gut instinct is that it's going to be pretty much the way the situation is today. That al-Maliki is somehow going to sort of manoeuvre his way through. The political impasse is going to continue. The security situation will continue. Maybe it will go up a bit, but it's not going to descend into full-scale sectarian strife. I think we're likely just to see a sort of rumbling on because each side has too much to lose by taking things to the next level. So I think probably the most likely scenario is that things will continue as they are until the next elections that are scheduled for next year, and then we'll see what happens then.
That's January.
I'm not sure exactly which March. And of course, the whole issue surrounding that is going to be whether al-Maliki will be given the right to take on a third term. There have been so many efforts to prevent that, and as I said, there was a law passed, I think, in January that would limit him to 2 terms. The government has now challenged that in the courts. The first appeal he lost, but there's now going to be another appeal, and the court have said, well, you know, we're going to postpone making a decision. So I think because al-Maliki has control over the federal court, I think we're likely to see that law quashed as well. So he will be able to stand for a third term. And as I said, I think we have to remember al-Maliki does have a lot of popular support among the Shiite constituencies. Ordinary Iraqis, Shiite Iraqis that I talk to think he's doing a great job. He's strong, he's tough, he's standing up to the Sunnis. So if he's allowed a third term, we might well see him back again. But as I never say never.
Ian McIntosh?
Yeah, Ian McIntosh, I'm an independent consultant working on our bill. My question is about the US influence. You mentioned that the US have been trying to, are influencing Turkey with regard to the pipeline project. But can you elaborate on what you see the influence of the US recently, or lack of influence in Iraqi politics? It seems that they have been very tacitly supportive of Maliki, which is not necessarily aligned with what their objectives are. I'm not asking you to predict, I'm just asking you to explain what you see so far.
I don't know about tacitly supporting Maliki, but I think their main concern is that the country doesn't break apart. Hence the pressure that they've put not just on this Turkish pipeline, but also on US companies that are trying to strike their own deals with the Kurdish government. So I think really that's what's driving their sort of politics, that Iraq stays together, it stays united. I can't really say more than that.
Why is that? Why are they so keen for it to stay united?
So much.
Sorry?
Sorry, John Maintain, I work at why are the US so keen to see Iraq stay united?
I guess partly as a success story, also because of the potential problems that could flare up with an independent Kurdish region, how that links into Kurds in Turkey, Kurds in Iran, Kurds in Syria. And I think how Iraq would work if it broke up isn't very clear, and it could prove more of a security challenge or risk than with Iraq as a united country.
There was a question over there.
Kieran Nolan with Petrotrovi. Just want to comment on the fact that in the Kurdish region there's actually been quite a lot of gases discovered by companies like Janelle.
Yeah.
And that Janelle has in part been buying up those assets. And the gas actually may be an easier product to get to market, or in that it doesn't fall within OPEC. It doesn't necessarily fall within the remit of the oil law. And that a gas pipeline to Turkey may make more sense as the first stepping stone, and they do that first, and then, having done that, then maybe an oil pipeline may be less controversial. And that Turkey, seriously is gas deficient.
Yeah, I can see the logic, but I don't think it's going to be any less controversial from where Baghdad is sitting.
I don't think that those pipelines are going to happen. It's just a question of when.
It seems like a foregone conclusion, but as I said, there are a lot of things going against it. I mean, the Kurds seem very much to think that they can force that reality on the ground, and then Baghdad will have to deal with it, much as happened with the ExxonMobil saga. So,
especially when contracts that are being awarded are very to individuals that are very close to the Turkish government.
yeah, I mean, it seems like a foregone conclusion, but still, the Turks are keeping their cards very close to the chest. I think there's probably some resistance to it. I've seen some stuff in the Turkish media saying we mustn't sacrifice Baghdad for the sake of Erbil. My instinct is probably further down the line it will happen some way or another, but it's going to cause major issue with Baghdad, and we're not there yet.
There's a question here.
Thomas Kingston, Bolton Capital. One question just now is, what's your understanding of what's behind some of the recent violence? Do you think it's a spillover from the Sunni protests, or do you think it's actually more extreme sentiments, perhaps Syria?
I suspect it's probably a mixture. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I mean, I think we're seeing...
Anything in particular?
There's nothing in particular, no.
And do you see the Sunni protests also as, I mean, you talk to them relatively negatively. I would see them as quite positive, and I just wonder if your view, to some extent, do you not see that that's indicative of actually a country that's functioning more like a democracy, that you're having protests, not violence? Do you not see that as a positive?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly the way it started out, it was a very positive thing, I say, because there was a deliberate attempt on the part of the protesters not to raise sectarian slogans, not to raise the banners of the past. But I think al-Maliki has handled the crisis so badly that now sort of things are taking a turn for the worse, and we're just seeing the whole country is suddenly becoming polarised, and I can see that slipping towards violence. So yes, when it all started, it was something to be welcomed, and it seemed like a good move, but I think now it's just got the country stuck, and I think it could lead to some really serious sectarian violence, and I think some of the violence, yes, we're seeing now is as a result of that. And clearly they're not going to stop, they're not going to give up. And so...
There was a question over here. Yes, sorry, in the back.
Sorry, you just asked.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, Samira Kawar from Argus Media.
Uh-huh.
Alison, what's your assessment of how strong Iranian influence politically is in Iran? I mean, to listen to leaders from some of the surrounding countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, that they tend to see Iraq almost as a surrogate of Iran. That is definitely an exaggeration, I know. But what's your assessment of how strong Iranian influence is in Iraq?
Okay, I mean, it's certainly there, it's certainly strong, but I think, yes, sometimes it is overplayed, and that one sort of forgets that Shiite actors in Iraqi politics do have a degree of independence. They do like to differentiate themselves from Iran. Even Muqtada al-Sadr, he was very sort of closely in Tehran's pockets, as I said, as he's sort of developed himself on the political scene. He's moving further and further away from Tehran. There is a distinction between Arab Shiites and Persian Shiites. So, yes, Iran is still influential. And of course, we mustn't forget they also have influence up in the Kurdish area, because Talabani and the PUK are very close to Iran and have relied on Iran. So there's an influence there. So, yes, it's there. Yes, it's strong. I mean, over the past few years, we've seen Iran really pressurising the Shiite camps to come together to support al-Maliki, to ensure that there's still a Shiite-dominated political system. So it's worked on that level. But I think, as I say, as those Shiite political actors are becoming stronger within their own right, we're gradually seeing a watering down of that influence. But, yeah, I mean, they're still key to the future of Iraq.
Any further questions? Your voice is just like okay, in that case, can I just say a couple of things? First of all, I think our next breakfast briefing is going to be on Venezuela. We don't have any publications on that, but it'll be on Venezuela, and I'm sure that you'll receive invitations for that.